My brother's rehearsal dinner was supposed to be one of the happiest nights of our family's year. 50 people in a private room at a steakhouse in downtown Calgary, white tablecloths, open bar, my mother in the new dress she'd been talking about since August. And then my father stood up, tapped his knife against his wine glass, and ruined everything. "To our son," he said, "who has made this family proud. A partner at 34. Your grandfather would have wept." Everyone clapped. My brother looked genuinely moved. His fiancée squeezed his hand. Then my father turned and found me across the table. I was sitting next to my boyfriend, who was wearing a clean flannel shirt and had, I knew, spent 20 minutes trying to get the grease out from under his fingernails before we left the house. My father smiled at me the way he sometimes does, not warmly, and said, loud enough for the whole table to hear, "And you, sweetheart, still playing house with the handyman?" A few people laughed. My mother looked at her plate. My boyfriend didn't move. I kept eating. I want to explain something before I go any further, because I know how this sounds. I know it sounds like I should have said something right then. Stood up, made a speech, defended myself, defended him. And maybe I should have. But I've been navigating my father's version of love for 31 years, and I have learned that arguing with him in public is like trying to put out a fire with your hands. You don't stop it. You just get burned. So I kept eating. And I told myself what I always tell myself in those moments. It doesn't matter. You know who you are. You know who he is. I just didn't know, not yet exactly who my boyfriend was. I met Callum at the farmer's market near my apartment in Edmonton, a Saturday in early October, when I had gone specifically to buy butternut squash and had no intention of talking to anyone. I was wearing a hat that said something embarrassing on it, a leftover from a bachelorette weekend, and I was annoyed because the lineup for the Good Bread booth was 12 people long. He was 2 stalls down, selling late-season vegetables, kale, parsnips, small waxy potatoes, a hand-lettered sign that said Harwick Farm, Lacombe County. He looked like he'd been awake since 4 in the morning, which I later found out he had. I didn't mean to stop. I was just looking at the parsnips. He said, "They're better than they look." I said, "Most things are." He laughed. We talked for 20 minutes about whether parsnips deserved a better reputation, and then somehow about whether any vegetable truly deserved a bad reputation, and then about what it meant to grow something from seed in a place where the frost came early and the margins were always thin. I bought the parsnips. I bought the kale. I came back the next Saturday. By December, I was driving out to Lacombe County on weekends to help with things I had absolutely no business helping with, but that he was patient enough to teach me anyway. I am a social worker. I've been one for 7 years. I work for a family services organization in Edmonton. We do child welfare casework, mostly the kind of work that follows you home even when you try not to let it. I knew, without question, how my parents would receive this information. My father is a civil litigation lawyer. My mother spent 20 years as a family court judge before she retired. My brother followed them both into law. In my family, careers are ranked by how impressive they sound at dinner parties, and mine did not sound impressive. It sounded, to my parents, like a choice I had made because I hadn't been able to make a better one. They were never cruel about it, exactly. It was more like a silence they had learned to keep, a polite absence of enthusiasm, the way my mother would describe my brother's cases to her friends, but describe my work as, "She's in social services, you know how it is, very noble." Noble. Like a word you use when you can't think of anything else to say. Cal knew all of this. I had told him within the first month, maybe because I needed someone to know, and he felt like a person who wouldn't flinch. He didn't flinch. He just nodded and said, "My family thinks farming is embarrassing too. Different reasons, same result." I asked what he meant. He said his family had wanted him to take over a different kind of business, that there had been a falling out. That farming was something he had chosen, and that the choosing had cost him something, but that he didn't regret it. I thought I understood what he was telling me. I was missing most of it. The rehearsal dinner. Let me go back. My brother's fiancée comes from a family of engineers. Her father, whose name is Warren, flew in from Vancouver for the week. He was the kind of man who seemed large in rooms. Not in an aggressive way, just in the way of someone who had spent decades being certain of things. He had said very little at dinner. He was seated at the other end of the table from us, near my brother and his fiancée, and I had noticed him watching the room in a way that felt like he was cataloging it. After my father made his comment, still playing house with the handyman, I heard a few more whispers pass down the table. My aunt leaned over to say something to my mother. My cousin, who is 22 and doesn't know better, looked at Callum with unconcealed curiosity. Callum reached under the table and put his hand on mine. That was all. Dessert came. The speeches wrapped up. People began to move around the room, the way they do when the formality breaks and everyone suddenly needs to refresh their drink. I went to the washroom. When I came back, I stopped just outside the room because I could see, through the doorway, that something had shifted. Warren had moved down the table. He was standing near Callum now, and his expression was not the polite, distant expression of a man making small talk with a stranger. He looked like someone who had just realized something unexpected. I heard him say, "The Harwick operation? In Lacombe County?" And I heard Callum say, quietly, "Yeah." Warren said, "You're the one who built that out?" A pause. "With a few people, yeah." Warren turned to look at my brother's fiancé, who had drifted over, and then at my father, who was nearby, and Warren said, not loudly, but in that way that carries, "Do you know what this man has built? We've been trying to get a supply contract with Harwick for 2 years. 2 years. They supply 4 major grocery chains in Alberta and BC. Do you know what their regenerative certification is worth?" My father's face did something I had never seen it do before. It went very still. I need to tell you about Callum properly because I'd only understood him in pieces. He grew up on his family's property outside Lacombe. His grandfather had farmed there. His father had too for a time, before pivoting to real estate and deciding the land wasn't worth what it cost. When Callum was 26, he bought the property back, a transaction that had apparently been complicated and that he had never fully explained to me, and began what he called starting over on something real. Over the following 8 years, he had expanded from 200 acres to nearly 800. He had brought in 2 partners. He had pursued organic and regenerative certifications that took years and significant investment. He had established direct supply relationships with grocery distributors in Alberta and BC. He had also, I later learned, begun consulting quietly for other small farms in the region, trying to navigate the same certification pathways, and had been written about in 2 agricultural trade publications that I had, of course, never read. He had never mentioned any of this to me in those terms. He talked about the work the way he talked about the parsnips, plainly, without performance. He mentioned the certifications the way you might mention that you'd finally fixed the fence. He said his operation was doing okay. He said he had a meeting in Red Deer the next week, didn't elaborate. He was, I understand now, the least self-aggrandizing person I had ever met in my life, in a family and a professional world almost entirely populated by people who were the opposite. I had not hidden him. I want to be clear about that. I had told my parents I was seeing someone. I had mentioned he was a farmer in Lacombe County. My father had actually laughed when I said it. Not cruelly, he would say, just with surprise. And my mother had said, "Well, as long as you're happy." In the tone that means, we have concerns we are choosing not to voice. They had met Callum exactly once before the rehearsal dinner, at a Sunday brunch at my parents' house in the spring, and my father had spent most of it asking my brother about a case, and my mother had asked Callum what you do at 200 acres, and then moved on before he answered. After Warren spoke, the room did not go completely silent. That's how it is in real life. It's not like the movies, where everything stops. People kept talking in small clusters, kept refilling their drinks. But something passed through the room, the way cold air passes through when a door opens. My father set down his glass. My mother turned from the conversation she was having. My aunt, who had been whispering since the handyman comment, went quiet. Warren was still talking to Callum. My brother had walked over. His fiancée looked between her father and Callum with an expression I couldn't read. I stood in the doorway for a moment longer than I needed to. Then I walked in and sat down next to Callum, and he glanced at me and said nothing, and I said nothing, and we both just sat there, while the room quietly rearranged itself around us. My father came over about 10 minutes later. He pulled a chair up across from Callum and sat down. He said, "So, tell me more about the operation." Callum looked at him for a moment. Then he said, "Sure. What do you want to know?" My father asked questions for the next 40 minutes. I sat and listened and ate the rest of my creme brulee. That night, driving back to my apartment, I waited until we were on the highway before I said anything. The lights of Calgary were behind us, and the sky was very dark and clear, and Callum was driving the way he always drives, one hand on the wheel, easy. I said, "Why didn't you ever tell me all of that?" He didn't answer immediately. He does that. Hold space before speaking, which I had initially found unusual and had come to find steadying. Then he said, "You never seemed to need it." I thought about that for a while. "My dad needed it," I said. "Your dad wasn't who I was trying to impress." I looked out the window for a bit. The highway was almost empty. A transport shot past us going the other way. "Does it bother you?" I asked. What he said, the handyman thing. "Does it bother you?" "Yes," I said. "It does. Because you didn't deserve it. And also because I didn't deserve it. And he does that, uses you to say something about me." Callum was quiet. "What he was really saying," I said, "is that my choices reflect badly on him. Me being a social worker reflects badly on him. Me being with someone who works with his hands reflects badly on him. It's not about you. You were just the easiest target in the room." Callum said, "I know. Does that make it better or worse?" "Neither," he said. "It just makes it true." The weeks after the rehearsal dinner were strange. My brother got married. A beautiful wedding, genuinely, at a venue outside the city with the mountains behind it, and my parents were gracious and warm all weekend and said nothing about what had happened at the steakhouse. My mother hugged me at the reception. My father shook Callum's hand. But something had shifted, and I felt it in the specific way my father now spoke to Callum, with attention, with the kind of careful interest he usually reserved for people he was professionally obligated to understand. It was better than contempt. It was also worse than genuine respect, because it was entirely conditional, and we both knew what condition it was contingent on. Callum noticed. He said nothing. About 3 weeks after the wedding, my father called me on a Tuesday evening. He does not typically call me on Tuesday evenings. I let it ring twice before answering. He said he wanted to take us to dinner, both of us. He named a restaurant in Edmonton that is very good and requires reservations made weeks in advance, which told me he had been planning this. We went. My father was careful and warm, and asked Callum good questions, and laughed genuinely at something Callum said about the certification process being designed by people who had clearly never touched soil. My mother talked to me about my work in a way she hadn't in years, asking follow-up questions, wanting specifics, listening to the answers. It was a good dinner. I want to say that clearly. Driving home afterward, I cried a little, which surprised me. Callum asked if I was okay. "I don't know," I said. "I think I'm angry." About the dinner? About the fact that it took this. I wiped my face with my sleeve. I've been doing this work for 7 years. 7 years. He never once asked me what a case looked like, what the kids are like. He never asked what it costs me. I paused. It took someone else, someone outside our family, telling him that my boyfriend runs an 800-acre regenerative farm with supply contracts across 2 provinces. That's what it took. For him to sit up and pay attention, to look at me like I might be worth paying attention to by extension. Callum didn't try to fix it, he just listened. "I know it's complicated," I said. "I know he's trying. I know this is probably as much as he knows how to do." "It is complicated," Callum agreed. "But I needed it to be acknowledged, that it happened, that it was wrong, not just smoothed over." A month later, I called my father back. I'd spent time thinking about what I needed from the conversation, which is something I learned to do from the work I do, identifying what you're actually asking for before you ask for it, because people cannot give you what you haven't named. I told him that the rehearsal dinner comment had hurt me, not just embarrassed me, hurt me. I told him that I had spent a long time interpreting his silence about my career as neutrality, and that I now understood it was not neutral, it was a ranking. I told him that I was proud of my work, that it was hard and meaningful, and that I had helped people through the worst moments of their lives, and that I did not need him to understand all of it, but I needed him to stop treating it as a consolation prize. He was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "You're right, I've been wrong about this for a long time." He said it plainly without qualifications, which was not something I had heard from him before. I didn't trust it completely, not yet. Trust is built in accumulated small moments, not in single phone calls. But I wrote it down afterward, in a notebook I keep, because I wanted to have it. in his actual words, the way he said it. My parents and I have started having dinner together more regularly, just the three of us sometimes, and my father asks about my work now, not every time. But sometimes, he asked me last month about a particular family situation I've been navigating. Nothing identifying, I'm careful about that. And he listened the way he listens to my brother talk about his cases. Like it mattered. Like it counted. I don't know if that's everything. I don't know if it's enough or if it will hold. Family patterns are deep and they don't shift cleanly. They shift in small ways and then sometimes they slip back, and you have to decide every time whether to say something or let it go. But I'm still talking to him. I made that choice deliberately, not because the rehearsal dinner is forgiven and forgotten, but because I am not interested in punishment. I'm interested in what's possible. Callum and I drove out to the farm last weekend. Late March, everything still brown and frozen looking. The fields flat and pale under a sky that couldn't decide whether to cloud over or clear up. He showed me the new section he's hoping to bring under cultivation in the spring. We walked the fence line for a while without saying much. At one point I stopped walking and just stood there looking at all of it, the land, the way it went on farther than I could see. He stood next to me and said, "You okay?" I said, "Yeah, I'm just thinking about the parsnips." He looked at me. "The parsnips." "First day," I said, "you told me they were better than they looked." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "That wasn't really about the parsnips." "I know," I said. "I figured that out eventually." The sky made up its mind and went clear, and the light came through cold and bright, and somewhere across the field one of the dogs was barking at something in the distance. I didn't need my father to have seen it first. I knew what was here. But I was glad, for both our sakes, that he was starting to. I keep thinking about something Callum said on the drive home that night. I asked him if the handyman comment bothered him, and he said, "Your dad wasn't who I was trying to impress." I've turned that sentence over so many times since. There's something in it that I'm still learning. For a long time, I measured myself by the room I was standing in, by whether my father's face did the thing, that particular softening, when I talked about my work. It never did. So I told myself I didn't need it, and then quietly spent years proving I didn't need it by needing it very much, just in private. What shifted for me that night at the steakhouse wasn't Warren's speech about regenerative certification or supply contracts across 2 provinces. It was watching Callum sit completely still while someone tried to diminish him in front of 50 people, and then watching him answer questions about his work for 40 minutes without once needing anyone to validate that the work was worth doing. That kind of steadiness doesn't come from being impressive. It comes from having thought very carefully at some earlier point in your life about what you actually value, and then building your days around that, even when it costs you something. Callum had chosen the land over the easier path his family wanted for him. He had spent years doing quiet, hard, unglamorous work, and he was not waiting for anyone's permission to believe it mattered. I'm a social worker. I sit with families in the worst moments of their lives. I write reports that affect whether children stay home or are removed. I carry those decisions home with me, sometimes for weeks. It is not a job that gets toasted at dinner parties. It is not a job my father understood how to admire, because admiration in my family has always been organized around visibility, titles, earnings, the things that translate cleanly into a sentence at a cocktail party. But here's what I've understood. Slowly, over the years in this work, the things that actually hold people together are almost never the visible ones. It's the caseworker who shows up a third time, the farmer who decides the land is worth saving, the person who stays in a hard conversation instead of leaving it. What my father was doing when he made that comment, and what I had been doing for years by swallowing it, was letting a narrow definition of worth do a lot of damage. He had inherited it. I had internalized it. Neither of us had examined it very closely. What I've had to build and am still building is the kind of clarity that doesn't depend on being recognized. Not stubbornness. That's different. That's just pride wearing a different coat. I mean the slower thing. The kind that comes from doing work you believe in, day after day, even when no one is raising a glass. From choosing a person not because he impresses the room, but because he is, in the most honest sense of the word, good. From knowing the difference between wanting to be seen and needing to be seen, and deciding which one you're willing to live by. My father is trying now. I believe that. And I'm choosing to stay in that, not because it's easy or because the rehearsal dinner is something I've stopped thinking about, but because I think there's something worth trying to build there. And because I am not interested in being the person who walks away from hard things simply because they're hard. That's the work. All of it, really. The cases, the farm, the family. You show up, you stay honest, you try not to need the toast.